Okay, I think we should start. Thank you everybody for being here. This is amazing. It's our first in-person event after 2 years. So yay for everybody. We survived. So thank you for being here. And wherever you are, for those of you watching our streaming version of this event, welcome to the browsing room and to this event for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. My name is Gabriela Martinez, and I am the department head of WGSS, and it is a pleasure to celebrate the intellectual and activist legacy of Sally Miller Gearhart through this lecture series that honors her. We can do this only thanks to the generosity of Carla Bloomberg, whose financial contribution established the ongoing support of this lecture series. Unfortunately, Carla couldn't be here with us today in person, but I hope she is watching this streaming, so I would ask for a round of applause to thank her. Sally Miller Gearhart passed away last summer after living a long and extraordinary life. Thus, this lecture, established several years before her passing, has today more meaning than ever. At the same time that we feel the loss of Sally, a first lesbian writer and activist, we also want to bring her forceful and joyful spirit back to be among us as we celebrate her life and learn about the tremendous legacy that she left for us and for the next generations to come. I will pass now the floor to Ellen Scott, professor in sociology department. Ellen was the former department chair for WGSS, and she was very instrumental establishing this lecture series and also in the acquisition of all of Sally's papers that reside here in special collections at the Knight Library. So, Ellen.
Hi, I'm going to add my welcome to the Sally Miller Gearhart lecture celebrating the life and legacy of the intrepid Sally Miller Gearhart. And welcome back also in person. This is the first time I've tried to stand up in front of an audience in person, so we'll just see what I remember of that activity. Again, I want to also add my thanks to Carla Blumberg, and I hope that Carla and Barb are watching, dear friends of Sally's, to whom we really owe the honor of this endowment for the lectures in Sally's name. So again, if you're with us by Zoom, Barb in Minnesota and Carla in Minnesota, thank you so much for everything that you've done for us. And again, I'm Ellen Scott. I was head of Women's and Gender Studies when Sally decided to donate her papers to our library special collections, and Carla decided to establish the endowment in Sally's name. After considering other university archives, we were quite honored to have Sally and Carla choose the University of Oregon to house her papers in our collection, which also includes lesbian feminist materials from Oregon Southern Land, OWL, T. Corinne, Juana Marie Paz, and the new Eugene Lesbian Oral History Project from our own Julie Raskin and Linda Long, wonderful contribution to the collection, as well as feminist science fiction writers such as Ursula Le Guin and Joanna Russ and others. As they considered and ultimately chose the University of Oregon, I had the wonderful privilege to meet Sally on a number of occasions when she could still make the trek up from her home in California to Oregon for our events. And for those of you who have not met her, and I suspect that's most of the audience, I wish you could have met Sally Miller Gearhart. She is extraordinary. I hope you get a sense of that from my comments, and also, of course, from Deborah Craig, who's here to speak with us about the film she's making to honor her life. But I Fierce, wry, gentle, sweet, ornery, all of this comes to mind when I think of the fiery presence of that human being that Sally was. So a little bit about Sally, we're a research institution. I'll start with her CV and her academic background. She had a BA in English from Sweetbriar College and master's from Bowling Green State and a PhD in theater from the University of Illinois in 1956. And she had a long and distinguished career as a university professor. She was associate professor of speech and theater at Stephen Austin State College in Texas from 56 to 60. She was associate professor of speech and drama from 60 to 70 and department chair from 65 to 70 at Texas Lutheran College in Texas. Texas Lutheran, there you go. She tried to end that career after only 14 years, when she left her position at Texas Lutheran in order to escape the discomfort of the Texas closet that then constrained her. She moved to San Francisco to start a new life in what people have called the boiling cauldron of social unrest of that time, and her version of leaving the profession was that she became an instructor at San Francisco State from 72 to 74. And I can only assume that San Francisco State caught on to the gem in their midst, and she was soon hired and spent from 1972 to 1992 as an associate professor and then professor of speech communication at San Francisco State. During that time, she was a department chair, an associate dean, a founder and coordinator of women's studies. She was also the author of a very long list of short stories, essays, and novels. Many of us know, of course, the feminist and lesbian science fiction novel, The Wanderground. Sally Miller Gearhart described herself as an able-bodied, post-Christian, water-treading, middle-class, southern white, lesbian feminist, female separatist, supportive of peace, freedom, jobs, justice, self-determination, and environmental redemption. Sally was the kind of lesbian feminist leader for social change who made no distinction between her work within the university, the source of her livelihood, and her work on the streets, marching, yelling, sitting, and generally protesting for change. She was one of the feminists who appealed to academia to include women. For the youth here, those days were not long ago, and we still have a long way to go in addressing gender equity in academia. In 1971, at a national meeting of her discipline, she urged her colleagues to, quote, mend their sexist ways and to begin by using language that included women instead of the oppressive masculine generic, unquote. This was met with laughter and hooting. Some of us, women, feminists, lesbians, are here now thanks to activists like Sally. Of course, not enough of us are here, and many of those of us who are here also because of class and race privilege. The institution has a long way to go before it is not the oppressive history it has been and is today. But to be sure, there has been change. Sally was probably the first out lesbian to be tenured in the United States and the world. She taught some of the first courses that included homosexuality in the title and early feminist courses on gender and communication. Sally helped found Women's Studies at San Francisco State in 1976, and it's maybe hard for many of us here to imagine the world that we're talking about, a world in which feminists like Sally risked their jobs to fight for inclusion, left their jobs in order to be out as lesbians, and were surprised when they were tenured despite their being very out, very loud, and very proud. Yet in many ways, we are still in that world. For example, in my time as WGSS head, we fought to create a department where there was a program without the right to tenure our own before we became a department. We struggled to establish queer studies and the minor, but thanks to some very loud, proud students here at the University of Oregon and faculty working with them, we are building new curricula and some much more radical programs and departments. And today's struggles and successes are absolutely integrally related to those that came before. So we thank Sally and her co-conspirators for their audacity, tenacity, and vision. Common themes run through Sally's life work as an academic, a writer, and an activist, or an activist academic, concerns with violence, destruction and conquest, the fight for equality and justice in a new world order, integrity, connectedness, and coexistence. But while common themes tie the life work together, Sally signaled early on and over in her essays her deep knowledge that what she expected that while she expected to work tirelessly for her whole life for a new world, she also accepted that her vision and her strategies and tactics would necessarily change. And in 1976, she wrote in Woman Power, Energy Resourcement that one's vision necessarily changes, but tireless visioning does not. She wrote, unless we somehow conceptualize that vision, knowing it will change, and ritualize the expression of it, we may forget entirely that we are a dynamic force in history. Sally lived up to her own challenge. She was indeed a dynamic force in history, always a force, challenging institutions of power and domination. She was also willing to change her position, sometimes quite radically, thus demonstrating that she was indeed dynamic. The list of examples of Sally the Force are too long. We will hear more today. But some examples, of course, are that she was an out lesbian professor and dean. She created a radical women's studies program. She wrote radical feminist utopian novels that brought both hope and controversial dialogue to many a young lesbian in my time, the early 80s and later. She was a fundraiser for the San Francisco Women's Building, which is now a historic building in San Francisco. She worked for and with Harvey Milk, the first out gay San Francisco City Council member and a radical co-conspirator in his own right. And you can also view Sally in the documentary The Times of Harvey Milk. And she demonstrated on the streets, always. She took to the streets for feminism, lesbian, gay, bisexual pride, civil rights, sexual freedom, disability, dignity, AIDS, education, peace, jobs, justice, non-human animals, Central America solidarity, clean air, Jesse Jackson, the Constitution, the Redwoods, and unions. Sally was a visionary who was also humble and willing to allow that vision to be dynamic and change in the face of changing times. We at the University of Oregon are very proud to be the home to her papers and our special collections. It's a treasure trove for students and for faculty and other researchers. And I look forward to hearing so much more about her life from Deborah Craig. And we're so happy to have you here today. And I'm going to ask Julie Raskin to come up to introduce Deborah, and then we'll move on to the program.
And I just want to recall, thank you, Ellen, that was just wonderful, wonderful summary and synopsis and explanation of the remarkable Sally Miller Gearhart. But I remember when she came with some of her band, and it was, she died this summer at 90, so it was on her 80th birthday. And I had her come to my lesbian studies class, and showed that clip from The Life and Times of Harvey Milk, where they're stumping together against the Briggs Initiative, Proposition 6. And it was so delightful to have her sitting in front of the room, facing the class, and the light coming onto the screen of herself younger. And she was delighted, to see this clip. And the students were like, this is like history right in front of them, because here's Sally at 80 telling them about this story, and then here's the footage of her. So the idea of having footage of Sally, and we'll hear a lot about that, is so precious and important. So I'm really happy today to introduce Deborah Craig, an award-winning documentary director and producer. I first met Deborah briefly when she was in Eugene in 2019, just before everything, screening her film, A Great Ride, in which Sally appears. It's a 33-minute documentary about lesbians and aging. I saw this film just when I was conducting the second summer of interviews for the Eugene Lesbian Oral History Project, a collection of filmed interviews of lesbians in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Deborah's film, A Great Ride, raised really important questions and ideas for me about what is specific to lesbian aging in terms of community, politics, life cycle, queer time, retirement, and the issue about long-term care facilities for queer people. And particularly where and how lesbian history is preserved and taught to younger people. A Great Ride premiered at the Frameline LGBTQ+ Film Festival in San Francisco in 2018 and was picked up for distribution by Frameline, has screened at over 50 film festivals around the globe and has won multiple awards. A Great Ride was also streaming on Alaska Airlines during June and July of 2019 to celebrate Pride, and I just would have been so happy on whatever was probably my last plane flight for a while if I had run into that. Deborah's films all use compelling personal stories to raise awareness about the challenges and strengths of underrepresented communities. As someone deeply interested in medical humanities, I appreciate Deborah's blending of all her education and training. She's a BA in history from Columbia University, studies in photography at California College of the Arts, and a master's degree in public health from San Francisco State University, where she currently teaches in the public health department. Today, Deborah's going to share with us her thoughts about her feature-length documentary film she is currently working on, Sally. This film is about Sally Miller Gearhart, for whom our lecture series is named. We must have been doing this lecture series for quite a number of years now. Do you know how many? 10 years. So it's been a decade, and now it's just very fitting, at the year that Sally passed, and Deborah's making this film, and it's our first reopening, to have the series dedicated. The speaker today to be talking about Sally herself. We are especially pleased to have Deborah Craig as our Sally Miller Gearhart lecturer this year, given Sally's passing. And this is also the first Women's and Gender Studies event. It's over 2 years because I'm not sure we were able to do it the year before. So it's been a long time that we haven't been together, and to really be able to celebrate this opportunity to have this lecture series. So we're so pleased. It's very nice to be looking forward with Deborah to the film that shares Sally's life and lesbian visions, community, scholarship, and history that Sally shaped and that Deborah is also continuing. So thank you so much for coming, Deborah.
I'm turning this on, but let me know if it sounds good. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to be here. I teach as well, and I'm just back in the classroom this semester. I love seeing faces even with masks on. So it's really a treat and a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'll do my best to follow up on those other esteemed speakers. While I was listening to them, I was also looking at this sort of fantastic, really classic picture of Sally, and just thinking about how that picture represents Sally in so many different ways. One, there's a dog on the couch, okay? And we've spent many hours with Sally, filming Sally, and there were always dogs and cats there, and so we always made sure to include them as part of the story because they were always a part of her life. And two, there is a sign up, protect your rights, no one's sick, so that speaks to Sally's activism. Three, Sally is smiling and looks like she's laughing. And Sally was not only brilliant, but one of the funniest and most fun-loving people I ever met. And four, she looks like she's wearing a leather jacket or something, and so she looks really strong and sexy, too. And that was a real important part of Sally, too. And in fact, the first time I met her, she was already 83, and she still started flirting right away with my camera woman. And I have a picture of my camera woman, blushing bright red while Sally was, grabbing her from behind. So those were some of the Sally thoughts that just pop into my mind, just looking at that one photo that says so much. Okay, so because I'm speaking at an academic institution, I figured my talk has to have a colon followed by a subtitle. So my subtitle is History, Herstory, and Mystery. So I figured that would make everybody go that must be interesting. What is she going to be talking about? But I will tell you, I'll step you through. And that, it reflects a lot, too. It reflects a lot about what we're trying to do and our journey, trying to figure out about who Sally Gearhart is and why people should care and why people would want to know about her. Okay. So I don't really need to introduce myself because everybody did such a nice job of it, but I have a very, very meandering career trajectory and a lot of interest. So I have a background in photography, in film, in music, in history, and so I spent most of this is for the young people here, I spent a lot of my life trying to figure out whether I was going to do music or history or photography or film. And then I decided, the hell with it, I'm going to do them all. Okay. And so that's where I ended up. And I urge you to do that. It sounds like a cliche, but go for what you love. Do what you love. And my partner, I was just telling somebody, I can't remember if it was Ellen or not, my partner always says, she just goes for the impractical like a moth to flame. So I'm keeping up that tradition. So that's a little bit about me. Sally Gearhart. So you heard a lot about Sally Gearhart right now. The fascinating thing to me is the fact that there are people in this room who knew Sally Gearhart, who met Sally Gearhart, who have researched Sally Gearhart, who know a lot about Sally Gearhart, and I have met people like that who really look up to Sally Gearhart, revere her, sometimes even put her up on a little bit of a pedestal. Her archives are here. We're so lucky about that. But I've met even more people who have no idea who Sally is. Lots and lots of people, queer people, gay people, lesbians, young gay people, have no idea who she is. We went back to a school where she taught in Texas, and we interviewed people who had been her students in the 60s, and then we interviewed students who are there now, who didn't know who she was, and they were angry about it. They were angry about the fact that they didn't know who she was. So I am a little bit angry about that, but I was also more and more I got to know Sally, the more I was perplexed about why we didn't know more about her. And that combination to me became very, very interesting, is that there's people who are like, of course I know Sally Gearhart. She changed my life. So we talked, I don't know if you guys know who Alison Bechtel is, okay? We would talk to Alison Bechtel. We're trying to persuade her to do animations for the film, but she's probably too busy. But she wrote really nice emails back and sent me a letter and said, Sally Gearhart changed my life. Okay. So why then, the mystery is, why is she such a huge presence in so many people's life, and why do people not know about her? Okay, so that really fascinated me. And then stick around. If you don't know about her, or you only know what you've heard today, stick around if you're interested in badass women, if you're interested in strong women who figure out how to live life on their own terms. That's one of the things that somebody one of the people that we interviewed said about Sally. She lived life on her own terms. So if you're interested in getting to know about a woman who really led the way, lived life on her own terms and with joy, stick around. Okay. So how did I meet Sally? It was an accident. Okay, it was a coincidence. And I'm sure I had heard about Sally Gearhart in some way or another. I'm sure I had watched Word Is Out, and I'm also sure I had sort of forgotten. And what happened is I teach in the public health department at San Francisco State. I know I'm drawn to the impractical, but I had a rare moment of being practical, so I went into public health and went into teaching. And I was working on a public health study of older lesbians back in the day when there was actually funding for studies of lesbian health. And I was working with a colleague of mine at San Francisco State, and we were doing focus groups with women and collecting data, and I was like, well, this data is fine, but these women are awesome. These women are amazing. I wanted to hear more about their stories, and I had also recently seen a film about LGBT aging. Some of you may have seen it. It's a really good film. It's called Gen Silent. And it's about older gay folks going back into the closet, and that happens. It's a real phenomenon, and it's heartbreaking, and it happens because of discrimination, because there aren't laws protecting us, and so folks, for example, might end up in a assisted living or something where they don't feel comfortable being out of the closet, or they are not allowed to live, with their wife. A woman's not allowed to live with their life. So I was struck by that film, but I also wanted, there weren't that many women in the film, and also through the health project I was doing, I was meeting a lot of women who were getting older, and they were out, and they were, comfortable in their own skin, and they were proud, and they had, and so I embarked on that project, and I met Sally through that project. The way I met Sally through that project is another woman working on the project said, "Oh, you're interested in lesbians and aging." Well, I have a friend who's in her 80s, and she lives on women's land, and she still cuts her own firewood with a chainsaw. I was like, what? I want to see that. And I was also, my interest was piqued because I knew about separatism and I knew about women's land. It wasn't really on my radar particularly. And I didn't know there still was women's land. I thought that was something from back in the day. And I wanted to see an 80-year-old lesbian with a chainsaw. So I got a crew and we went up there and we went to meet Sally. We didn't get to see her chainsawing, but so that's me and Sally. Was wonderful and charming. She lived in Willits in Northern California, and there's me with our crew. And I'm not a separatist. I was not a separatist, but I always went with a crew of women. It worked really well, I think, to make Sally comfortable, make her friends comfortable, and then also, again, Sally invariably would flirt with the camera woman, and she loved having the mic put on her because the sound woman had to say, "Well, can you pull your shirt out so I can drop a mic down your shirt?" And she would be like, "Come on, I am ready for you." Okay, so that was our first encounter with Sally, and it was an adventure. Okay, so this is not, Sally was 83 at the time. She was losing her hearing. She was getting thin, getting a little bit frail. She still had plenty of energy, plenty of get up and go, and we asked her if she would give us a tour of the land, and she said, "Absolutely, please hop in my Jeep." And I had never seen a Jeep quite like that. And so we hopped in. There were not only did the dog Bodhi have a monopoly on the front seat, but there were no seats in the back. So we were in the back kind of rattling around, but I told the camera woman, "I'll block the back door." And so I put my feet across, and I kind of held on to her when she was trying to tip over, and we thought we might fall out the back, but we made it. We didn't. So that was a great adventure, and she gave us a ride around the land. And sometimes we were on the road, and sometimes we weren't sure. So here she was, 83, and still having adventures, and still being like, "We're going to go find the road, even though I'm not sure where it is." Okay. And so she was smart and funny and self-deprecating. And the more we found out about her, and the more we talked to her, and the more we went back, the more we found out, like, this woman, she's not just like smart and funny woman living in her little cabin. She made a difference. She had an impact. And everybody I showed the film footage to for the film I was working on got to her, and they were like, "Wait a minute." They either knew who she was, and they were like, "That's Sally Gearhart. I didn't even know she was still around." Or they got to her and they said, "Who is that? I want to know more about her." So I literally had to fight with my producer and my editor to make the film that I wanted to make about lesbians and aging, because they wanted to go straight to making a film about Sally. So what we did is we finished the film about lesbians and aging, and then we didn't take a break, and we went straight to the Sally film, and my partner is still grumbling about that. And when she asks when the film is going to be done, I tell her, "Sometime soon." Okay. So now we're in this next adventure with Sally. And Sally was about nothing. She was about so many things that you've heard already, but she was also about life as a big adventure. And so I hope this trailer that I'm going to show will give you a sense of that. I'm sorry, we don't have it perfectly figured out, but I'm getting close. Yeah. I'm going to, let's see, sorry, it's not seamless technically. Sorry about that. It's the first time out of the gate on this one. So as you can see, so smart and funny. I hope at 83 I'm driving a battered Jeep. Oh, by the way, if you were wondering about the upholstery, her dog ate it. So that's what I aspire to. So I have a little bit less time than I thought, so I'm going to hustle through a few of these slides so we can get to the mystery. Okay. So some of you in here are documentarians, some of you are not. But really, it is like putting together a puzzle or putting a quilt together. And it's a little bit like research in a way. When you start out, you don't know what you're going to find. And then you start finding stuff and figuring out how to piece it together, whether it's a puzzle, whether it's a quilt, you're piecing all of those pieces together. And the thing about, so that's the way our process works, is at the beginning of the process, we're really looking for those puzzle pieces and trying to track down who Sally knew, which is, and I haven't finished that endeavor yet, it's a huge one. So that we're trying to find out who knew Sally, what pieces, who was in Texas, who was in Virginia where she grew up, who was at the Women's Studies Department, who was an activist with her. The other thing about Sally is that she was very different from other people. She was really, one of her oldest friends called her a Renaissance woman. She had so many interests. So we're looking into women's studies. We're looking into communications. She did theater. She was interested in religion. She wrote really seminal works on religion while she was at it. So she wasn't that prolific in one field, but she did write works that had an impact in many different fields. So that's what we're in the process of. We have many, many puzzle pieces now, and we have a story arc. So in other words, we don't have a script, but we have a story arc, and we're putting those pieces together based on that story arc. The interesting thing about it is that, especially I think it's just human nature, but especially with Sally, the puzzle pieces don't always fit. You remember how when you're trying to shove a puzzle piece in and it doesn't fit, so you got to look for it somewhere else. Well, with Sally, as you'll find, that's a little bit with the mystery. Is like, do all these puzzle pieces fit together in a way that makes sense? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That's maybe because we're not putting the puzzle together in exactly the right way, but maybe that's part of human nature, especially Sally's. Okay, so what kind of puzzle pieces do we have? Let me give you a little bit of an overview. And it might give you a sense of why this has been a pretty long journey for us, is that we've interviewed probably over 40 people now. Occasionally short interviews, but some of them are long, like 2 hour, 1.5 hour, 2 hour interviews where my camera person was like, Deborah, wrap it up, please. I'm like, okay. And we really wanted to go all the way back. So when I first met Sally, I was interested in the end of her life and asking her about aging, and interested in aging in the women's land community and how did that work. And for this film, we really wanted to go all the way back to the beginning, and certain things that were just sort of a fantasy I had actually became reality. We ended up going back to Virginia. Sally had a half-brother that some of her oldest friends didn't know about, who lives in Virginia about 5 miles from where she grew up. So and my fantasy was, yes, we're going to go to Virginia and we'll film Confederate statues, okay? And we went to Virginia and we met with her half-brother, we did not talk politics. I'm sure he's very conservative. He was like Sally. He was tall and sweet and smart and had a beautiful voice, and we had had amazing stories about Sally. And we went to the town that Sally grew up in, and there was the Confederate statue, but apparently it's going to come down soon. But those were her roots, okay? And I think you can't really understand her fully without understanding where she came from. And so I feel very, very fortunate that we got to do that. She also went to college in Virginia. We were not able to go to Sweetbriar College in Virginia, but we were lucky enough to meet one of her classmates from Sweetbriar, who I actually went out to coffee with this woman who went to college when she was 15. I thought I was going to meet a 90-year-old. Instead, I met a young and spry, 87-and-a-half-year-old who told me all about Sweetbriar and filled me in and really enlightened me to the fact that these colleges that I have the stereotype they're just grooming grounds for young women. This was 1948 to 52. They're grooming these young women to get married. They were women spaces, okay? They were spaces where really women could really flourish. And then they went and got married. Okay, but that was really an eye-opener to me, is this is a place that women could come into their own and thrive. We also interviewed a woman who was, I think, Sally's oldest friend, who met Sally when she was 15 and Sally was 21 in summer camp. Okay, and we interviewed her, and she said, I knew I wanted to get into Sally's tent. Okay. So I don't know 100% exactly what she meant by that. But, there you go. So this is a picture, and this is way before Sally was out, and way before anybody was out. And people were finding ways to find one another. And Sally had an impact. So I am talking to somebody in her 80s about experiences she had with Sally when she was 15. And those memories are still visceral to her, okay? So I talked about Pat, who went to Sweetbriar with Sally. We went to Texas and interviewed a former colleague of Sally's, and we interviewed some of her former students. Again, these are students who had Sally back in the 60s, and some of them were really almost in tears in the interview with what an impact Sally had had on them as a teacher. She was teaching theater, she was teaching communications, she was not out. Some of them were gay, some of them weren't. But Sally had this lifelong impact on people. And then, of course, we interviewed students at San Francisco State. We interviewed professors at San Francisco State. We interviewed fellow activists. So you saw the African-American woman. You saw Gwen Craig was very, very active, and Cleve Jones, both very active in the No on 6 campaign. So we've really tried to get people from all aspects of her life. And then Sally lived for the last 30 years of her life in a small town in Willits. So we tried to get to know what that town was like, and to try to understand, why did she end up there? Was it women's land, or what kept her there? Or was it full circle that she grew up in a small town where she knew everybody, and she ended up in a small town where she knew everybody, basically knew everybody, young and old, gay and straight, women and men, by the way. So we have so much material, we joke about doing a mini-series, but I don't think that my marriage would survive, so this is not going to happen. What are those other puzzle pieces? Not just the interviews, but the archival work. And just again, shout out to Linda Long, shout out to Carla Bloomberg, shout out to all of the folks, shout out to Molly McBride, who has helped us navigate the archives and really get some of the material we need. That's so important. And it's something that I'm going to, hopefully, time permitting, talk about later. The crucial importance of that, that so that lives, these life stories that are so important are not lost. We are at risk of losing some of those stories. So shout out to you all. So Sally is a puzzle, I mean, if you saw me untangling that thing in the film, that was her dog leash. Who has a 40-foot dog leash that's like some wire thing that gets all tangled? Sally Miller Gearhart. Okay. So Sally was this woman who had an impact wherever she went, and is also a puzzling character. And so I've spent the last 4 years trying to figure out how to, not just where do the different pieces fit, but what is the answer? What is the answer to this question? How can I solve this mystery of who this person is? So she was at the forefront of this battle, and then she lived for 30 years in the woods in the middle of nowhere. And I would talk to people like Cleve Jones, and he'd say, what happened to Sally? She just disappeared off the face of the earth. Well, she just didn't disappear. She went to Willits. But so what's the mystery? What happened? Okay. And people we talked to would say she's a beacon and she's a lighthouse, and yet young young people, including young, politically active queers who take women's studies and queer studies, don't know who she is, okay? And she described herself as a separatist, and, she loved all of her neighbors, gay and straight, young and old, and I went up there once with a camera guy, not a woman, and she was like, there's a man on the land. And then she promptly started flirting with him and saying he had nice legs, So that ended up with us coming up with this idea of looking at those three facets, the history, the herstory, and the mystery. Okay. So we'll at least get to herstory. Then I won't tell you about the mystery. I'll leave it a mystery, right? Okay, so history, we're starting not at the beginning. We want the story to tell the beginning, but we want to start in the middle where Sally is just really at the height of her powers and her fame, to really show this is a woman who deserves a place in history. All of her accomplishments, all of the first, and you heard some of them, the women's studies program, that was one of the first women's studies programs ever. Hello, it wasn't that long ago there was no women's studies, okay? I spoke to some high school students. I said, you know what, if it weren't for people like Sally, we wouldn't have no gay-straight alliances and their jaws dropped. So we want to restore her to her rightful place in history, and that's what that history part is about. But the other thing is that we want to go back and find out where she came from and look follow that trajectory. How did she get to where she was? How did that transformation happen? But also find out in that process, what we find out in that process, that all of her contributions were part of a collaborative effort, okay? So that's where the herstory comes in, is nobody does anything alone, whether it's Sally Miller Gearhart or Harvey Milk. So we have these films that are putting Harvey Milk up on a pedestal and putting whoever else up on a pedestal, and really, they weren't up on a pedestal. Really, they were put up there by other folks who were down in the trenches doing the day-to-day work. And so we really want to look at Sally's accomplishments as community, sort of group efforts or collaborative efforts. And that's where the herstory part comes in. And then finally, the mystery. It's like, what happened? I mean, that's the first thing that when I really realized after meeting Sally, this was a woman of importance. Then the question was, why don't people know her, and why is she here in a cabin in the woods in her 80s virtually alone? Okay, so that's one of the mysteries. Okay, and we also are the other mystery is really like trying to put together somebody's life story. How do you do that? How do you do that? So we're really interested in exploring how a life story, and it's my little metaphor, whether it works or not, it's not so much a sculpture where we're going to get these are the perfect bits that tell us exactly who Sally is, but more of a kaleidoscope where we've had 40 different interviews, and sometimes you don't necessarily have 40 different stories, but you might have 35. We have people saying Sally was a pacifist, and we have somebody else saying, well, in White Night Riots, she was lighting police cars on fire. It's like, really? So which was it? So how do you put together the story of a really complicated life? Okay, so history, and again, I might try to hustle through some of this because I think Ellen talked a lot about it, but hidden figure, Sally's a hidden figure. I don't know if you will watch the film Hidden Figures, but so many women are hidden figures. Somebody else took credit, or nobody thought that their accomplishments were worth mentioning because they happen to be women. Again, Ellen mentioned most of those things. So Sally is just a perfect example of female erasure, and a lot of people who really, have Sally in their heart are very, very upset and angry about that female erasure. I think Sally was less angry about it and more hurt about it. So for us, one of the first aims of our film is to try to counteract that female erasure and tell people she was important. You should know about her, and you would want to know about her. And so that's a little bit of an overview of the history. San Francisco State, it was almost like serendipity when Sally just left Texas, spent a year elsewhere, and then came to San Francisco at the perfect time. It was the perfect convergence of all these different movements for social change, and Sally just hopped right in, she was almost like she leapt out of the closet and, took her top off at the same time, as you can see, and all those presents, and was just ready. She was at the right place in the right time, as we would say, and she was the first lesbian to gain tenure. So let's let people know about that. She helped co-found the program. Again, as you learn, some of the courses, it's fascinating even to look through the course catalog, what they taught at that point. So one of her classes was patriarchal rhetoric, the rhetoric of sexual liberation. And by the way, again, Sally was active in many and interested in many different fields. So one of the things we're really interested in, looking at her theories of communication and their contributions to communication. And she looked at rhetoric. She ended up writing that rhetoric is violence, okay, and trying to persuade other people to your point of view is violence, okay. And so that's, to me, fascinating and relevant today. And that's the other thing that we can keep on coming back around to, is that people should know about Sally because she did some really important things in the 70s and 80s, right? People should know about Sally because we need those skills right now as well. So another part of history, Sally was incredibly influential in a fight against the anti-gay Briggs initiative. And I know for young gay folks, it can be shocking to realize that the Briggs initiative was going to outlaw anybody who was queer or an ally from teaching or working, not just teaching, but working in the public schools in any capacity. Okay, so for Sally, that was an existential threat. Harvey was a figurehead of that movement, but he wasn't a teacher. Okay, so for Sally, that was an existential threat, and she was the poster child for the Briggs initiative. She and Harvey Milk, and she debated Briggs, and you saw a teeny clip of that there. Well, Sally grew up in the South, went to church, knew the Bible. She could, any of those people in the religious right quote the Bible, she could rip them to shreds by quoting it right back at them. So I would talk to her about Harvey Milk, and she said, Harvey was an amateur. Because Sally was a debater, a debate coach, and she knew the Bible. So she was really able to be, and she was just able to step up there and speak out on behalf of that movement. What else? Sally wrote about religion, okay? And there was a certain point in time. I mean, I grew up in Berkeley. We thought our neighbors went to Catholic church once a year, and we thought that was very odd, okay? So it took me a long time to learn the importance of religion and to really realize the key importance of religion in Sally's life, even though she basically left the church. And so she was active in the movement, the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, back when they called us the homosexual, okay? And very involved in trying to get the church to be more open and accepting and to try to educate the church. She wrote some really influential books, and I just want to read that one quote from there. A couple of things. One is she wrote something called The Miracle of Lesbianism, which I love, right? Maybe we could call it the film Sally Gearhart, The Miracle of Lesbianism. I don't know. But here you go. Hope you can hear me. The lesbian is thus a miracle. First, because she can express her love in the face of thousands of years of condemnation of such experience. Second, in a society so steeped in woman hatred, for a woman to love another woman, for a woman to love herself is a miracle indeed. Okay, so isn't that beautiful? And for somebody who have gone through that experience of coming up through Christianity and to live through it and come out with it, with something that's sort of a critique of Christianity, but also sort of an embracing of the pieces of Christianity that make sense. So she had that spirituality in her that she kept, and she also had that incredible desire to get in there and shake things up and throw bombs in periodically here and there. So, for example, she also had a quote about religion where she basically said, I'm paraphrasing, I'm looking forward to the death of the church so we can begin to practice the gospel. Okay. So that was a really key part of her life. Now I want to move on to this idea of herstory. Okay. So really, we are trying to be extra conscious that this story of Sally is a story with Sally at the center, but it's a story of many women. It's our collective story. And that Sally's story is this always, in every case, in everything she did, in all of her interests, there's other women there. Some of them, incredibly important, and some of them just, groups of women surrounding her, but sometimes, it's her partner or her farmer partner or, her colleagues, like that. So the Women's Studies Department, I have to correct people sometimes when they say Sally founded the Women's Studies. Nobody founded the Women's Studies Department. It was co-founded. And there were 3 or 4 women who were at the center of that, but there were probably at least a dozen women. And we interviewed a woman who was Sally's age who was in the department. And she said nobody was in charge. Okay? And I'm sure we'll find a way to include that somewhere in the film. That's the way things happened. It was really a collaborative effort. The Briggs Initiative. Sally and Harvey were the figureheads. There were thousands of foot soldiers knocking on doors all over the state. It was a state initiative. Really brave people were knocking door to door, and they would pair up a man and a woman, and they would go knock on doors in the Central Valley and places that were very conservative and try to persuade people that voting for this initiative was not the right thing to do. And Sally was very involved in women's land, and if I have time, I'll talk to you about that. And of course, women's land was a collective effort. Sally wrote fantasy novels. The Wonderground is the most well-known fantasy novels. She wrote several others. Those not only envisioned a collective women's utopia, but they were a collective effort. Sally liked to write, by the water, naked with her typewriter. Topless with her typewriter, right? But Jane was there. Jane was editing her work. Other folks, Dorothy, another colleague of his, always looked at her work. So it's not that Sally wasn't the author, but it was a collective effort, not just to write a book, but to re-envision the world where women, were in a different position. So we're really, really conscious in making this film that we just don't want a women's version. We don't want to take the patriarchal version of history of like the great men and then have the great women version of history, but we want to take a more collective look at how history happens. Because a lot of us, I've gotten used to being up in front of the room as a teacher. When I first started teaching, I was like, they're all staring at me. Why? Some people don't like being up on front. Sally loved it. Some people like working behind the scenes. And they have as valuable of a contribution, and we need to explore and, analyze and understand that. So this is a little bit about the Herstory in the Women's Studies program. It was a joint venture. Not only that, they not only involved many women, it was a joint venture with the students too. And they had students involved in hiring decisions. So they did, so they did, I'm going to hustle through this. They had women, I'm a lecturer, I haven't been involved in hiring decisions. And as the previous speaker said, very much an activist department. So this was not a department that was separated from the social justice movements of the day. This was a department that was part of the social justice movements of the day. No 1-6 was a grassroots collective movement, as I was mentioning. Separatism was a collectivist movement. This is really fascinating to me because Sally, like so many other activists, was really, I think, torn between this idea of really wanting to go out there and change the world and march and throw bombs and say controversial things, and to just remove herself from that, okay? And so the women's land movement is just like, enough of this patriarchy, I'm out of here, okay? And so that was a little bit about that. It's like, and that makes sense. So separatism has all its problems with class and race, and does this make sense for social change? But I think for a lot of social movements, not just for lesbians, but for movements for social change for people of color, et cetera, that separating out is a key part of just trying to figure out who we are and getting respite from the world, okay? So that was a key part, and starting to understand that was really a learning experience for me because I had known about separatism but really never understood it. And I realized later, I had the luxury to not need to be a separatist because somebody had paved the way to me to feel comfortable coming out in my own community and not feel like I needed to create a safe space for myself that was separate to come out. Okay? And so this women's land community was actually a physical expression of that idea of collectivism. And it represented so many different things. It represented women's independence, women just learning to use power tools, learning to do things on their own, and feeling that freedom of being able to come into their own in women-only space. Again, interdependent. So I interviewed Jean Crosby, who was an activist with Sally and also her partner for quite a few years. And she described that land community where Sally lived for her last 30 years. They formed it in the 70s, but Sally retired there. Jean said Sally was the spirit of the land, and Jane Gurko, was the matriarch. She made things happen, okay? And you need the spirit and you need the matriarch. You can't make it happen if you don't have both, okay? And the other thing about women's land and separatism is let's not romanticize. It's a wonderful, beautiful vision of women coming together and creating their own space, supporting one another financially, moral support, spiritual support. And they argued all the time. It was contentious. It was messy. They didn't plan ahead. And some of the mystery of when we got there and found Sally basically alone on the land was that in the 70s, people didn't plan, you guys. They're just like, we're going to go build a house. We don't know what we're doing, but we'll figure it out as we go. Okay. And one of the things they thought about was, can we cut down a tree or not? It might fall down on our cabin and ruin the house. Sally was like, no, we need to have a prayer circle before we can cut down the tree. Okay. So, and then the last thing, again, in Herstory was that Sally's speculative fiction, again, was that idea. And again, I didn't understand separatism very well. I'm not a science fiction person. I read The Wanderground. I'm like, no, this is okay. I kind of sort of get it. And then I realized you have to imagine a better world before you can create one. So literally, women had to imagine that women would be able to vote before they could push for women to get to vote. Okay, so Sally's The Wanderground is a vision of a world where women can come into their own and can communicate with one another and have their own space. And by the way, there's fascinating parallels between The Wanderground, the fictional, the fantasy novel, and Sally's own women's land community. And rumor has it that this woman is represented in such and such, and so we haven't figured that all yet out. That's one of the mysteries. So I didn't realize we were going to stop so early, so I have more than we have time for. So we have, this is a long clip on separatism. You want me to just show a part of it? Okay. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I thought we had more like over an hour for me. Can anybody, I can't get my cursor. No.
cursor?
I don't see the cursor.
That's weird.
Yeah, I was doing that, and then is it showing now?
No. Do you wanna?
We could try to escape and then find it. So I'll just show part of this. This is brand new. Is it?
It's not.
It's not. So we need to do this. Show. Play from current slide, and see if it comes up for us now. Here we go. See, that should work. So I'll just show like 5 minutes of this because we're out of time. But yeah, no, I understand perfectly. Stop it there. I'm so sorry. I think I thought I had more time, so I don't want to disrespect your time. So why don't we, those links will be available. That's a very, very rough, this is the world premiere of that clip, by the way, so it's a little rough around the edges. But we're really interested in exploring the richness and the contradictions in separatism and how it worked for some women, how it didn't work for some other women, and yeah, like that. Let's see. Okay. Let me just make, so that's the separatism. So, and then the mystery part, I guess I'll just wrap it up with the mystery, is that a lot of times films start with a question, research starts with a question, and we want to find the answer to this question, so we put all our effort into finding the answer to the question, and then we write our thesis, and the thesis is the answer to the question, okay? And so we are trying to answer questions in this film. In the history section, we're trying to answer the question, who was Sally Gearhart? And who was that public persona of Sally Gearhart that made those incredible contributions that we think everybody should know about and should be in the history books. And then in the Herstory section, we're also exploring a question of what was the context in which her work happened and who were the people who made that work possible. Okay, but we're also really ending with a question, not so much with an answer, because it's complicated. Okay, and you try to figure out what somebody's life was all about, and you interview people, and you interview more people, and an answer starts to emerge, and then sometimes somebody says, actually, no, she was lighting police cars on fire, and you're like, wait a minute, is that right or is that not? Which one is true? Okay, and the first mystery to us was, why was Sally alone on the land when we got there? What happened? And we spend a lot of time trying to figure that out, and we have some maybe answers, but we're not 100% sure. Like, one maybe answer is there was a big disagreement on the land, or maybe separatism exploded, and another answer is life happens. People get older and they move away and communities fail. And the other thing is, there turn out to be many, many different Sallys, depending on who you talk to. You know, so some people Sally was their teacher, and some people Sally was their lover, and some people Sally was their neighbor. And sometimes those things connect, and sometimes they're very, very different. And by the way, Sally was a huge bundle of contradictions. As she herself said, I live in Northern California on a mountain of contradictions. Okay? And then the other thing is, we've been doing research, and things are getting lost. Okay, it's so great. We have the archives here and photos. We have probably 1,000 photos from the University of Oregon. Okay, and I've been trying to find things, and the word is out. Original interview with Sally, the full interview, not just the excerpts. We can't find it. You know, we found some stuff, and then there is, the word is out, interviews. The debate that you saw in the trailer of Sally debating Briggs, the original footage is missing and nobody can find it. Okay, so that's the other mystery, is like, our history is made up of the little bits and pieces that somebody had the forethought. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Linda Long. Thank you. That somebody had the foresight to preserve. And so our history is made up of those little bits and pieces. You know, Enid, Sally, saving bits and pieces. My partner doesn't save anything, so the historians are going to be angry at her. So that's, again, the big mystery. So I had a lot of other stuff I was going to show you, but I don't want to go on. But I do want to go back down to the very end here. Sally's enduring importance. We don't think that she just needs to be restored, like she was erased. She's not in the Milk film, the fictionalized account of Harvey Milk. That's an outrage. She should be in the history book. She should be in the films. But she should be there not just because what happened at that time was relevant, but because we need her now. We need people like her now. She was, as you heard, you know, concerned about the environment, concerned about violence against women. I mean, she was in the forefront expressing concerns about those issues, and those haven't gone away. And she was a bomb thrower and a radical who said the most outrageous things. One thing she said was that men should be reduced to 10% of the population. and we have her ex-partner saying, Sally would sometimes want to say things, and I'd say, Sally, are you sure you want to say that? And she'd say, yeah, and she really did love everybody and find ways to connect with everybody. And one of my favorite writings of hers is Notes from a Recovering Activist, where she talked about figuring out how to connect with people who you disagreed with and how to find common ground. So that is why we need her now and why she's relevant now. And then there's a quick thank you and all my info. If you want to see all the slides I didn't have time for. And then here's just also a little note about another Sally that we lost that was a really key person in the lesbian and queer community here. That was another sometimes sung, sometimes unsung hero. So I wanted to just give a shout out to her. I'm wearing a button she made, and her partner Enid is here. So thank you so much. And if anybody has any questions, we have time.
12 minutes for questions. Maybe some of the questions could go back to some of these slides that she couldn't show, but it's open for questions. And don't be shy. Yes,
yeah, I do. It's got sold. So it's sort of sad, but it's fascinating to me. I mean, again, for years we were just wondering what happened, why is she alone here, what's going on? And we actually interviewed a man named Jim Matulski, who was a reverend at a gay church, who really studied Sally and looks up to Sally. And he said the thing that makes most sense to me is that communities have lifespans. And so we first were looking at Sally's women's land community of why did it fail? And then I started to think, it didn't fail. It had a lifespan, and it had many, many decades of very rich community of women, that some of whom lived there full time and some of whom didn't, but they gathered there regularly. But another answer is that her close friend and former partner Jane died. The one who I said she was the matriarch, she died before Sally, and so it was just life happens. People get older, people move, and people die. And so there's one woman who still owns land up there, but that community. And I think, so for those folks in here, if there are folks in here who study women's land, I think a lot of the women's land communities are not surviving. Because it's fascinating also because young queer people don't necessarily even identify as lesbian or don't feel like they need to have women's land, their own separate space to come into their own maybe. So, it's almost like people are sometimes a victim of their own success. If people feel comfortable coming out at school and at home, then they might not feel a need for women's land. But good question. Any other questions? Yes.
I think maybe related to that and related to the maybe last two slides you talked about with history. Sorry to talk about myself.
No.
I identify as a queer person in that balance. I did women's studies when I was undergrad, but now I find myself kind of wanting to turn away from feminism because I struggle with how do you really grapple with the legacies of feminism plural. And it seems like it strikes me that there's this parallel with that too in what you're talking about the mystery. And I guess I would love to hear a little bit more about how do we understand Sally's legacy, the legacy of feminism today through her story?
Let me see if I can answer that. When do you say you find yourself turning away from feminism because of some of its flaws, you mean? Yeah. So what I would say is, the wonderful thing about Sally and so many of her colleagues, like that woman Corky, who was at the beginning of that clip, that woman Corky said, when we interviewed her, she said, the 70s, it was such a wonderful time, feminism, and we made so many mistakes. And so what I find so appealing about talking to many of those women is that they were doing something new, and they were trying to change the world, and they know they made mistakes along the way, and they acknowledge it. And even separatists, so that's so appealing to me separatism never appealed to me when I was a younger lesbian. I didn't understand it. It wasn't a good fit for me, and I didn't understand the need for it. And I got a better understanding for it out of those women at those particular times needed it. And for most of them, it evolved, especially when they had children and they were sons. So I look back we look back at our history, and we all made mistakes, and I feel like we need to look back at them and learn from what they did and learn from the mistakes they made too. And Sally, so for example, I did one of many, many grant applications that I got turned down for, which mostly happens, and I was able to get feedback. And one of the feedback I got was, one of the grant reviewers was non-binary and felt that this didn't feel relevant to her about these separatist women. And I'm like, that's really a shame, because I bet you anything we wouldn't have gotten to non-binary without separatism, and B, I bet you anything if Sally had gotten to meet somebody who was non-binary, she would have been like, tell me what it's all about, and then she probably would have tried to seduce them too. So that's the way I look at it, is look at history kind of like you look at your parents, like with affection and forgiveness for all their flaws. I don't know if that answers your question, but we really, really do not want to put anybody on a pedestal. And Sally especially has been one of those people that other people who put on a pedestal. And we want to show it as more complicated. We're really interested in talking to women of color who say separatism did not work for me, because that's an important part of the story. So I hope that answered. And by the way, I've gotten a lot. Another one of the mystery is everybody has their own Sally that they're very attached to. And Sally was a drama queen, and she loved to be on stage, and there was a lot of drama in her life with exes and blah blah blah. And some of the drama, and we've encountered some pushback in making this film, and I've tried to understand it. And why understanding is. And people angry sometimes about the way we portrayed Sally. And what I try to understand it as is, we're not showing their Sally. We're showing a different Sally who was one of the Sallys. And so, for example, when we first started filming, some of Sally's close friends wanted us to stop filming. And I think basically they were being protective because Sally was frail by that time. Sally had some dementia by that time, and so they were trying to protect her because they didn't want to see the frail Sally. But the frail Sally was one of the Sallys, and she was still reciting poetry and enjoying life and smoking and eating bacon and all kinds of things that you don't think that separatists in the woods are going to do, So, any other questions? So my apologies for not planning my time carefully enough. There are, so if we go back here to one of the clips that I didn't have time to show is on our website there. And the other clip that we only showed part of, if you're interested, and feel free to reach out to me. I can share it with you. It's not public yet because it's really in progress. The clip I didn't show at all, no. The clip I didn't show at all is 9 minutes, but you can watch it on our trailer. And it is about Sally at the end of her life and what's happening on women's land at the end of her life. And that's a fascinating story, too. It's almost like her lesbian community is kind of crumbling. And a lot of the folks in Willits and her small town step up to the plate. So one of the women, a lot of her neighbors were straight, and her community members were straight or were men. And a lot of them stepped up to the plate to care for her. So she had a more of a diverse community, I think, at the end. She wasn't, like Penny said, Sally wasn't separate from anything. So Sally was on the mountain of contradiction. She was, and I think that's the way to understand that time as well, as people were very, like if you saw the woman Mina Caulfield, like what about the class struggle? Mina was a big Marxist, so you had a lesbian feminist and a Marxist, and they found ways to have a fruitful conversation about their differences. And that's what was so exciting about that time. And what's sad to me is when we can't have that, which is, I think we're in a period now where it's very challenging for people to have fruitful conversations about their differences. One of Sally's best friends in Willits was a straight woman, Republican, who loved Reagan. We went to her house. We walked in the door, and there's a big picture of Reagan, and we're like, uh-oh. And she just loved Sally. And she said they would talk, and it's like, why do you think that? How can you possibly believe that, and they would talk about it, and laugh and, talk about the things they agreed about and talk about the things that they disagreed about. So, any other questions?
So just to wrap it up, if Sally were she would be here, what do you think she would tell all these younger artists?
She would say, get out there, okay? There is still a fight to fight. Get out there and do it and have fun while you're at it. Do it with a sense of spirit and love, okay? A sense of not vilifying your enemies. I'll leave you with this. So Sally once was at a big rally, okay, about the Briggs initiative. And everybody's up there, yeah, go Sally, and Briggs is terrible. And Sally said, if Briggs were here today, what do you think I'd do to him? And everybody's like, yeah, you're probably, she thought that she was going to say she would just, punch him out. And she said, I'd do it. She said, I'd give him a big kiss on the lips. Okay, so there you go.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.